Hi, Dan Kerr's DK Analytics. Thanks a lot for tuning in. It is May 18th, 2017. We think it's time for an update on the video publication front. We'd like to put this into place as a complement and an update to post number 19, which we put up onto the site last weekend. We, in fact, encourage you to reference it. And if you're so inclined to spread the word on the post, on the publications, post reports, as well as these videos, if you find them worthy of your time, of interest, and possibly of allocation help. This current post, this video is not only going to reference post 19, but it will also be based on more prepared remarks than usual. A little bit less off the cuff or by recall, given the gravity of the political situation which I think we currently face. In essence, I want to discuss here today the economic, the financial, and the political storms that are raging around the world, and this juxtaposed against huge asset bubbles, especially in bonds, stocks, and I'll argue in real estate. And those bubbles are, make no mistake, the progeny of absolutely unparalleled global money printing. Let's start with the political, as all things are political. My political science teacher 3 to 4 decades ago said, politics is nothing other than codified philosophy. So, and it absolutely impacts things, especially today where we are increasingly removed from the rule of law and moving to the rule of men. As consistently stated in videos and posts and reports, and also as per the most recent French presidential election, it looks as if the global deep state, that is, the actors invested in the antithesis of national sovereignty, national solvency, property right protections, and sound money, and frankly, sanity, that deep state is not going away anytime soon. It's clawing its way back, it would appear, after small victories against these people in form of the Brexit and the Donald Trump election last year. Some details. In the US, the statist corporate media, in cahoots with the Democratic Party and the K Street establishment wing that controls the Republican Party, really controls the Republican Party. That statist corporatist media is hell-bent on fabricating crises related to Trump, the Russian election scandal, which isn't or wasn't, the fraudulent scandal surrounding the firing of FBI Chief Comey, which is totally in keeping with constitutional powers granted the executive, and also appropriate given this gentleman's absolutely reckless and lawless behavior, as demonstrated by reading a litany of charges against Hillary Clinton and then taking the Justice Department into his own hands and declaring that she should not be prosecuted, but that Americans dare not play such games. I mean, it's just absolute zoo. Well, the goal of the statist media, which again is in cahoots with the establishment power brokers, the people that have lifted themselves from the stricture of constitutional government and sound money. The goal is, in essence, to render Trump or a movement, reform movement, back to the Constitution, if you will, back to sound money, impotent. And then longer term to get rid of him or impeach him. That is the goal, effectively, of the deep state, which extends to the media, to college campuses, to the administrative state, to the halls of Congress on either side of the party divide. Now, Trump, meanwhile, is a very compromised candidate, to be sure. He's a deal maker. He's looking more like a big spending lib every day. His background is not only as a real estate mogul, but as a crony, somebody that can benefit himself of the collusion between big government and big business, that holds sound money, property right protections in low esteem, if any esteem at all. Witnesses take on the 5th and the 14th Amendments, which protect life, liberty, and property from government seizure. He's in effect for government seizure and has in his business practiced those very stunts. So Trump also has, unfortunately, divorced himself from most of his campaign promises, which looked like they were more balloons than promises, including the fact that he is ready to sign on with a bill from Congress that sees U.S. government spending rising by 4%. That is funding all kinds of things that he claimed he would seek to defund. And he's on board with that and giving it a thumbs up. In the meantime, just for a flavor of just how wasteful the U.S. government is in spending, consider that the ultimate rhino, the Republican in name only, John McCain, Senator McCain from Arizona, in his most wasted reports, highlights $1.1 trillion, roughly a fourth of U.S. government spending, that is wasteful or questionable in nature, and $294 billion in annual spending on programs no longer authorized to receive funding. So a return to constitutional government, to the rule of law, and to appropriations conform spending is looking dimmer by the day. In that sense, note that the Department of Defense Inspector General last July highlighted $6.5 trillion, $6,500 billion in inadequately documented or inadequately supported Army spending. A huge misallocation, a mind-bending misallocation. Excuse me, contrast this, if you would, with Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the Constitution, which says, and I quote, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and accounts of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time." This deals with, in essence, the Congress's sole power of the purse function, which is tightly tied into the keystone of having a representative republic in the first place, that people can vote or no longer vote for people that represent them based upon partly or largely their fiscal sanity, or in this case, insanity. What's the upshot? I think the upshot is neither the GOP leadership, quote unquote, nor the Democratic Party in Congress have shown any readiness at all to return the U.S. to fiscal sanity, despite $20 trillion in debt, despite $199 trillion in unfunded liabilities, the net present value of commitments the U.S. government has made, Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, bailout funds for Freddie and Fannie, and so on and so forth. So if you consider the fact that they won't even touch neither the executive or the legislative branches an attempt to reduce government spending, much less the growth of government spending, then we have presidential betrayal accompanied by legislative destructiveness. Not a happy political situation, except for those benefiting from the status quo, the select few, in other words. Now, to add injury, copious injury to insult, consider the fact that the Trump presidency has very likely just been neutered, or more brutally put, castrated, meaning any slim hope of constructive reform of the government back into its constitutional limited power, separation of power, a limited central government box. It's gone. It's not there anymore. And even as spearheaded by a deeply flawed Donald Trump. Why? Because yesterday, on May 17th, an independent or a special counsel was appointed to investigate alleged Russian interference with the 2016 election campaign, even though there's not a scintilla of evidence, not a shred of proof that this took place. Nothing, nada. A big witch hunt, as Trump accurately said. And who has enabled all this? Boy, with friends like these, you don't need any enemies. You guessed it, the hapless statist Republicans, both in the Trump administration as well as in Congress. And remember that the GOP controls both the executive and the legislative branches of the federal government. Yet both the Attorney General Sessions and the Assistant Attorney General recommended a special counsel to dig into the Russian election collusion fabrication, in the process extraditing themselves, de facto admitting that the matter warrants an independent investigation. In other words, where there's fabricated smoke, there's fabricated fire, even though there's, again, not a scrap of evidence suggesting that Trump worked with the Russians to influence the 2016 election. This breeds hugely destructive life into utter demagoguery by the left and establishment Republicans alike. Contrast this fabricated Russian collusion scandal with the Obama administration's 8-year reign or unconstitutional reign, in which Fast and Furious, arming Mexican drug gangs with army-grade weapons, Benghazi, blaming the U.S. Embassy takeover in Libya on a California man that allegedly created an incendiary video that he didn't even create and was put into the slammer into jail for a year. The IRS targeting of Tea Party groups, the crass harassment, intimidation, and the extensive, intensive, and sometimes bankrupting audits that the IRS has been leading against such groups. It's an absolute violation of the First and the Fourth Amendment, free speech and due process and protection of personal property and privacy. So the establishment. Oh, yes, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention possibly the ultimate unconstitutional aspect of the Obama administration, namely Hillary's unprosecuted, treasonous use of her unsecure private server to conduct State Department business with. Comey addressed these abuses, but decided that it wasn't worth prosecuting prosecuting, he decided to also wear the Justice Department slash the AG hat. Yet at the same time, he had warned Americans, don't you dare engage in this kind of behavior. I mean, this is banana republic stuff, right? What's the upshot? The establishment, or the deep state, appears to have shut down any incremental chance for constructive reform by Trump, by his administration. And not to sound self-serving, but our long-standing claim in our May 2016 call-out after Cruz bowed out of the GOP presidential race after having lost in Indiana, and we said it didn't matter if Hillary or Trump won, because statism and cronyism, or the status quo, would be the bottom line result. With the plutocrats ready to assert full fiat control, we dare say that our strategic allocation callouts remain timelier than ever. Let's turn to economic and financial developments. People know, I think, very well around the globe that America in the retail space is doing very badly. Not a surprise given the overstored space, where there's something like 3 to 4 times the amount of retail square footage in America compared to the rest of the OECD world. But we have very poor American same-store sales growth numbers, which are actually, if you use the real world inflation index, are negative same-store sales growth. And it's no wonder that we have these massive store chain closures going on, or stores that various chains are closing at an unprecedented rate. Consumer spending is 70% of the GDP, so this is no laughing matter. Staying on the same page, record or near record debt at the government, the corporate, and the household level aren't bullish either. Those are, in effect, consumption that was pulled into the present and is going to impact negatively future consumption. You're borrowing from the future today. So we also have real U.S. earnings, weekly earnings that are heading south by over 1% for 2 consecutive quarters year on year. And again, if those real earnings were looked at with a real world take of inflation, they would be down 5-6% year over year for quite a while, which is in sync with where the real GDP growth would be if we had honest inflation accounting. U.S. industrial production in the month of April up a sky high 1%, over 10% annualized, a real bullish sign of, well, at first glance, a reindustrialization, the promised one, which obviously can't happen overnight, but that's neither here nor there. What it amounts to is the industrial production surge, the skyrocketing 1% in April versus the month before, is on the back of heightened car production, auto production in the U.S., which in turn is more channel stuffing, pushing cars and trucks onto dealers' lots than it is sign of robust end demand. And by the way, car loans, which are up 50% since Q208, are starting to hemorrhage, and the non-performing aspect of car loans is marching skyward. And as a result, this misleading 1% surge in industrial production in the U.S. is not on a sound basis. And if anything, again, is borrowing from future growth with the downsizing impact to come. Not exactly bullish for an economy. Meanwhile, housing starts, again, down over 2%, 2 months back to back on a year-on-year basis. And over in China, that other huge command and control economy, we've had lots of turbulence of late as regards the banking system and the liquidity of the banking system. That economy's debt is up 14-fold since the beginning of the new century, from 2 trillion to 28 trillion to between 250 and 300% of GDP. And you can guess what the obvious, the bridges, the nowheres, the condos, the airports, the things that were built based upon a statist or command and control business model have led to a lot of bad investment decisions, lacking returns, and as such, a lot of bank loans are now thrown into question, as is bank liquidity. So we have a liquidity issue, and we have a long-term banking solvency issue, all related to debt and misallocations. That's going to come home to roost, and the Chinese government is going to step in and do the inevitable, that is, print more money, thereby engender even more misallocation and long-term monetary inflation risk. But it's par for the course. What's our takeaway? China, with its 14-fold increase in debt in the last 16, 17 years, will no longer, during the next global economic downturn, which we have arguably already commenced, be able to be a Keynesian growth engine, a fiscal stimulus engine for the world, because of the state of its balance sheets and because of liquidity concerns and loan problems. So if you take China on the one hand and compare it to globally over-leveraged GDP, which globally speaking, debt at all levels to GDP, a debt at all levels other than financial to GDP, is 3 to 1, or some $230 trillion, 3 times global GDP, up almost $90 trillion in the last 10 years, growing at roughly twice the rate of nominal GDP growth. The world is not only tremendously over-indebted, but its kissing cousin, horribly misallocated. And this is thanks to statism pushing aside free market capitalism. And this brings with it declining productivity growth and an absolute outright decline in productivity that we're starting to see. So in the next downturn, which I think we're already in, neither the Middle Kingdom nor solid global productivity numbers, there are none, is going to rescue this economy from a material and probably lengthy retrenchment. Thank you, central banks of the world, for nearly a decade's worth of counterfeiting, printing press-based counterfeiting. You have gotten the global economy all upside down, and we will only see the big impact of this as this inevitably comes apart at the seams. So not only does global debt tower over global GDP 3 to 1, but there are over $400 trillion in notional value derivative risks, meaning the global money center banks have exposure, have made a bet in essence on interest rates staying low or going lower to the tune of over $400 trillion, which is what, 6-7 times the global GDP. Obviously, if interest rates were to spike, either for solvency or monetary inflation risk reasons, these banks would immediately be bankrupt, and with it, the entire global fiat monetary system would come unglued, and the world is run on credit, so that would be a tsunami of the first order in terms of an economic contraction, the likes of which we haven't seen probably since the Great Depression. With China and Asia slowing down, and India, and with India and its incessant bureaucracy, its creaking infrastructure, and its attack by the government, by the Prime Minister Modi on cash and property rights, it remains the world's biggest developing economy featuring permanent potential. We've got India with its issues. We've got China/Asia slowing down, notwithstanding the recent uptick in Chinese GDP, reported Chinese GDP growth. But if over 50% of the world's population, which is in developing nations, well over 50%, is likely going to be facing substantially slower growth for a host of reasons, including the debt impasses, poor productivity, misallocations, all this wonderful, the Keynesian stuff comes home to roost, together with accommodating central banks, obviously, that's the key. But if we take a look at a much slower emerging market economic growth rate and juxtapose it against OECD nations, whether it's Germany, whether it's Japan, whether it's, yes, I'm going to call South Korea a developed nation, whether it's Australia, which have fed, which have supplied all kinds of things for the emerging world economy to ramp up its infrastructure and consumer spending, why they also, the OECD countries, are going to be hit with a lot less stout demand from the emerging world on the one hand, and they will remain victims of their own impediments in the OECD world, which range from aging issues to over-indebtedness to unprecedented QE-enabled misallocations as well, to unequaled monetary inflation risks. And you know that all this leads to more cronyism, to collapsing productivity, to less property right protections, be it tax-based, be it regulatory-based, be it real property-based, as in Sweden or Germany, or, for example, the transfer of citizen assets to non-citizens in the OECD. Now, let's, as a backdrop, compare the less than sanguine political and economic and financial developments with valuations. And this is where the world truly is upside down. Despite our threatening political, economic, and financial trajectory, global bonds, stocks, and real estate are all in serial bubbles, meaning they are devoid from any hope of a sound return for safety of capital, for capital preservation for those that buy the assets at current levels, at current valuation levels, at current prices, excuse me. But it appears the valuations are predicting or stating that we have been paying down debt, we've improved productivity, we have societal aging stabilized, and we have solidified the very rule of law and property right protections, which enables the free market, the invisible hand of Adam Smith, to generate productivity and rising living standards, when in fact we've done just the opposite and doubled down on our mistakes from 08 until now. Because we have more debt, less property rights, bigger balance sheets of central banks, and so on and so forth. So not exactly the high road, the low road. Well, we know why we have these overvalued assets. It's because of central banks. It's because private market participants no longer determine asset prices, interest rates, and currency rates, one currency against the other. This is obviously due to, again, the global central banks, which have preempted the work of the free market in determining asset values, interest rates, and currency values, and as such have usurped the free market mechanism by which to maximize long-term wealth of nations' outcomes. Well, this is great if you're in a plutocracy, if you are a big beneficiary of central planning, as the plutocrats are, but it never works. This kind of trajectory, this kind of back in the USSR insanity, never works for the broad masses. It only works for the select few, the 1% or the fraction of a 1%. The hangers-on of those that control, and in essence, for the people that control the levers of power in a fiat government, fiat money structure that we're in, rule of men instead of rule of law, paper money, fiat money instead of sound money. And the plutocrats and their hangers-on can avail themselves of the resulting money printing, wealth transfer, and of K Street style cronyism. Our bigger point is this: retail investors that today keep pushing up stock market around the world may well be helping corporate insiders unload their exercise stock options, which they got for a song, at bubble valuation levels. Or retail investors that directly or indirectly through their pension funds buy bonds with negative real-world inflation-based yields may in fact be helping their governments continue to finance redistribution, very much including Obamacare, and Main Street pummeling regulations, taxation, and litigation. Even as those investors, as consumers, when they wear their consumer hats, find insurance rates going up because insurers can no longer earn anything in a fixed income market, and as their pension funds are increasingly in jeopardy because monetary policy is made for the benefit of debtors and not savers. We will continue to argue that such investors, people buying now or having bought recently at very elevated prices in bonds and stocks and real estate, very high valuations compared to normalized earning streams, those are putting capital at risk, and they're paying way too much for their portfolio assets earnings power. And because of the huge global risks, be they political, economic, or financial, the valuation insanity is even more pronounced. Said differently, we continue to view overall return prospects in bond stocks and in real estate as bubbles looking for a needle. And this very much also includes the huge growth in student loans and car loans in the US, these trillion-dollar babies, which are going to give investors black eyes. So our conclusion, fittingly, as this is the month of May, sell assets with high cost basis in May and go away and wait for bargains. Consider safe cash, the type you can't bail in, and real money, namely physical gold and silver outside of the banking system and not stored in some well-known warehouse that governments can access and do Roosevelt kind of things with. Consider those assets and also consider vital, scarce resources for portfolio enhancers as portfolio diversifiers. And in so doing, consider the Russian economy and Russian assets, especially in the resource space. Recall that Russia is hated, so assets are cheap. Its currency, the ruble, is barely off the floor. Its foreign debt, however, is down 28% in 3 years, and its gold reserves are up 55% in 3 years. It features a flat 13% income tax rate and no capital gains tax for residents. Okay, sadly, however, the rule of law there is anything but robust. But then again, neither is the rule of law of property right protections in the West. The difference is that Russian assets are so cheap that if things go only half right, you've got a real good chance of making good returns on your investments, which you certainly can't say for bubble assets that we've been discussing here and in our latest post number 19. And as always, recall that when economies and currencies go to hell in a handbasket, food and energy supplies or assets always go up in local currency terms as central banks and fiat monetary systems will print those currencies into oblivion. And now, as a closing remark, some modern portfolio theory heresy, but keep it quiet. Sometimes safe cash or real money, physical silver and gold outside of the system, and so-called satellite assets in general need to be brought into the center of portfolio universes. The optionality that they bring in terms of being able to scoop up deflated bubble assets, especially bonds and stocks and much of the globe's real estate, with intact capital, sell into these bubbles, right? Could well prove to be the upcoming asset purchase opportunity of a lifetime for those investors that get out of harm's way in time. That, dear listeners, is our video message for today, May 18th, 2017. Thanks a lot for tuning in. We hope you found this of interest, and we will see you later. Bye-bye.